The following video is for educational purposes only. Do not attempt to replicate any of the stories or betting strategies discussed in this video. If you have or know someone with a gambling addiction, please seek help immediately. Adam Bradford was just 21 when he discovered his dad David, now 66, was being sent to jail for stealing over £50,000 to pay debts from a gambling addiction his family didn't know he had. Now 30, Adam had to unravel and tackle the emotional and financial mess left behind. In April 2014, my family's lives were turned upside down when the phone rang on the evening of my mom's birthday. It was a brief conversation. "You don't know who I am," said a voice. "I'm a solicitor and I've been instructed to give you a call. Your dad has been given a 2-year sentence and he's in the back of a van on his way to prison in Liverpool." There's no way to describe a shock like that. My mom, my brothers Alex and Ryan, then 18, and I had no idea what he'd done. You see people caught with drugs and they go to jail for 6 weeks. To get 2 years? All sorts of thoughts flashed through my head. The day before, something had sounded fishy to me. He said he was off on a training course for a day or two. I thought, that's odd, he's never done that before. But he said he'd ring to let us know when he'd be back. But he didn't call. My mom couldn't reach him, and now we knew why. Except we didn't really know anything at all. He was given a 30-second phone call and rang us later that evening. But he didn't explain what happened. He barely said a word. He must have been in shock himself that it had finally come to this. He told us what prison he was in, gave us the computer password, and explained where he kept the bills. That was it. It was surreal. We sat and cried. We were all traumatized, but I don't know how my mom coped, and on her birthday as well. The next day, we got tipped off by a school where my dad was chair of governors that they'd been approached by the local press. Before we'd been given an opportunity to find out what had happened for ourselves, a newspaper called and asked, "Can you tell us how you feel?" I didn't let on that I didn't know, and the next day there it was, on the front page, "Gambler jailed for fraud." My dad had stolen £53,000 from the company where he had earned £70,000 as finance director to pay gambling debts. He signed off what got paid out, and he had re-invoiced for his own wages until eventually it got spotted. My biggest feeling was disappointment. It's the total opposite of what you would expect an accountant to do. But in other ways, I was relieved that at least it was none of the strange, dark things we've been thinking it could have been. The horrible thing is that we live in quite a small community, and everybody found out when we did. It was all over Sheffield. I felt like walking out the door with a bag on my head, and my mom didn't want to go to the shops. She wouldn't leave the house. But the strangest thing was discovering there was this other side of my dad that he'd kept secret. My mom didn't work, they didn't have a joint account, and everything had been so under his control that we didn't know who the mortgage was with or who our energy providers were. My mom quite rightly held a lot of anger towards him. She'd been married to him for 35 years and had a lot of questions that needed answering. Me, I needed to find a way for us to get in control and to understand legally where we stood in terms of his debts. The first thing we did was go to the Citizens Advice Bureau. It's fair to say we didn't uncover a very good picture. We discovered he had 21 credit cards and loans, including payday loans, and the household bills were in arrears by a year. He'd remortgaged the house, and there was a repossession order in place because he hadn't kept up with repayments. We'd had a big shock, and now we were dealing with massive financial damage. It was like being hit several times at once. It took 9 months before we got to the bottom of everything, and it came to £500,000 worth of debt. Some loans were put on hold, but the rest of the debts were consolidated and had to be paid. I had a good job as a manager of a charity, the only one working in the house, and almost all my salary went to paying his debts. It was a lot to take on, trying to pay for a house that you can't afford to live in. When I look back, there were signs of him seeming depressed over the past year. He was out of work for a few months and didn't seem to be able to pay some of the bills. My mom questioned why he didn't have any savings and why he'd been out of work. Once he went to prison, we realized he'd been fired because he'd stolen the money. Things started to make sense. We'd visit him in prison, but most of our conversations were quite bland and transactional. It took him a long time to say anything much about what had happened. It didn't help that because he had medical issues and needed a breathing machine at night, the only prison that could accommodate that equipment was a higher category. So he was in prison with murderers. We weren't particularly comfortable in the visiting room. The first time we got close to the truth was when he wrote a long letter a few months into his sentence, admitting what he'd done, how he felt, and explaining that he wasn't in control of what he was doing, that he didn't mean to hurt anybody. Now that the initial shock and anger had passed, I wanted to try to understand. I've never had any form of addiction, and it's difficult for people on the outside to understand that when the gambling takes over, normal thinking just disappears. That's how my dad says it was for him. He was released for good behavior after 8 months and wore a tag for the rest of his sentence. My mom didn't want to pick him up, so I went on my own. Which wasn't without fanfare as well, because pretty much the entire BBC followed me to pick him up. He was a shadow of himself when he came out. I took him to Weatherspoons for an English breakfast, and he just seemed lost. Mom still had a lot of anger. The trust was broken, and that is hard to repair, but she gave him an ultimatum. She said, "I want you to come back and fix things, on the condition you are transparent about everything. We need to monitor what you're doing." He worked as a delivery driver doing 4 different jobs. There's very little you can do with a fraud conviction. Dad had only ever been an accountant and was obviously never going to be an accountant again. So it was a case of what on earth can he do that's meaningful? He wanted to give something back, so we set up a charity called Safer Online Gambling Group to push awareness of gambling as a mental health problem. Gambling addiction is under the radar. 83% of people don't seek help, and it has a higher suicide rate than any other addiction. It's put in a category with alcohol or drug abuse and is equally devastating. But what can make it worse is that it's very hidden. Especially since the internet, there's no need to be down the betting shop or in a casino all night. You can pretend to be working or sending texts when actually you're placing bets every few minutes. We also launched a therapy app called Bet Protect, and my dad now works as an advisor to the company Crucial Compliance, who made it. We still don't really know why he became so addicted. We've talked about his childhood and sometimes not feeling good enough about himself, and maybe being ambitious and wanting things that he couldn't necessarily afford. We worry about him relapsing, but everything is monitored now, and my parents have a joint account. Their relationship has improved, and he's conscious of making the effort to be honest and open about everything. It could have gone in many different directions, but the family has managed to stay together. Some of the debts have gone, some are still being paid, and he's going to be paying them off for the rest of his life. If he ever does. But we're proud that he is using his experience as a force for good and leaving a positive legacy. Wow, so that was a pretty enlightening story. Now, I quickly want to go over 2 things in relation to this video. And the first is that a gambling addiction may appear invisible on the outside. And the second is that someone you know may be struggling with a gambling addiction at this very moment, and you have no idea that it's going on. Now, the crazy part about this story is that this guy was able to go his entire life pretty much without his family even noticing or knowing that he was addicted to gambling at all. Like, his wife mentioned that they were married for 35 years, I think, and she had no clue or idea that this was even transpiring. Now, the biggest problem in this story was that the father, he had complete control over all of the finances. So the wife and the kids even, they had no idea where the money was going, if the bills were being paid. They had no idea where their mortgage was at, and they were just left in the dark. This can be incredibly dangerous when someone or one individual has complete control over the household's finances, and if that one person gets infected by a gambling compulsion or a gambling addiction, it could ruin the financial security of the family's future. And this also relates back to this point of someone having a gambling addiction and you may not even know it. And the wife mentioned that they were married for, I think it was 35 years, and she had no clue that this was going on. She had no idea. Obviously, there were writings on the wall where the father all of a sudden was out of work and then he wasn't able to pay some bills, and the wife questioned why he didn't have any savings. So there were some breadcrumbs of this story that was being left behind. And again, what's really scary about having a gambling addiction is that you can't see anything on the outside that was affecting this guy, because the problem is all internal and it ends up just being a mental health issue. And what's really alarming about this video was that this father ended up having, I think it was 21 credit cards. He had a payday loan and even remortgaged his house, and which ultimately led to him stealing money from his workplace and leading to jail time. Now, this is why I believe that gambling addiction has one of the highest suicide rates. It's because you eventually get to this point of no return where you feel like there's nothing you can do. And it feels like there's just no way to recover from that insurmountable amount of debt that just looms over your head. So hopefully you found this video interesting, or at least shed some light on the true dangers of a gambling addiction. So if you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment down below. And if you want to watch another gambling addiction story, you can watch that right here.